For me, those are the first four. There's one other one which is related to this project that Eyal Weizman and I did about Mengele, which is the kind of evidence, or the primary kind of evidence that was at stake in this trial. So the history of war crimes trials up to that point, international war crimes trials, was rather sparse. There had been an abortive trial of some of the young Turkish leaders for the Armenian genocide immediately after the First World War, but it was abandoned. That was the first place, in fact, where the notion of crimes against humanity was legally constituted. That was one of the charges against the Young Turk leaders. Then there were the trials of the Nazi leaders at Nuremberg and of the Japanese wartime leaders at Tokyo. And in Nuremberg in particular, the primary evidence had been documentary. The strategy of the prosecutor in Nuremberg was to allow Nazi documents to incriminate Nazis. There was also testimony from the people on trial when they agreed, but there was not a lot of victim testimony. There were not a lot of images introduced. There was very little physical evidence offered besides paper. So documents seized from German state and military archives were the overwhelming majority of the evidentiary material there. The prosecutor at Nuremberg, the prosecutor in Jerusalem, Hausner, tried a radically different response and intentionally a radically different strategy about evidence, and intentionally so, which was to abandon most of the documents and feature primarily the testimony of survivor witnesses. Primarily survivors, not always, and in fact not often, witnesses to Eichmann himself, but witnesses to the Shoah in general. And in this trial, I think in a profound way, the notion of the witness or the survivor witness as an agent rather than just as a victim was produced. And I think it dominated our interpretation both of the Shoah and in general of evidence about human rights ever since. Human rights evidence is primarily evidence of victim survivor witnesses. We were interested, Eyal and I were interested in the emergence recently of a third notion of evidence, namely physical or forensic in the ordinary sense of the word, evidence, primarily evidence of mass graves. But that was not at all present in the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial was the trial in which the witness, the survivor witness, was born, I would say. And that again was a focus of Arendt's critique. She thought that it betrayed this relation to the one charged, the accused in the trial, and she thought that it was show business. In particular, the scene which appears in von Trotte's film of the witness named Kazetnik who faints while he's testifying. He stands up, says something extremely dramatic, and then collapses. And that notion that the testimony was not simply I saw X do Y, but was a testimony to a certain kind of unregistrability or unintelligibility of the traumatic event, of the overwhelming experience. That, as an understanding of what it means to bear witness, was also born in that trial. That's a starting point, at least.
Okay, great, thank you. There is a lot of things we can move to a lot of directions. Let's start, let's say, with this idea of new type of crime, new type of criminal, new type of evil. How intellectuals respond to this new type of criminal activity, crimes against humanity, and so on. In a sense, what kind of critique or thinking is possible after such a after birth of such criminal, such an evil? how to comprehend, how to react, how to think about it, what kind of, let's say, philosophy or ethics or political philosophy can emerge, and what kind of intellectual response should be appropriate to this new kind of evil or criminal.
Yes. So I think that in order to answer that question, we have to first ask the question what the movie is precisely about. And I think that when you look at it in a whole, it's not about so-called engaged intellectual who is the person who is trying to put things in the right place, in the right time, and to put it in public. It's not about the woman who survived the cancer, then from France she went abroad, and then as a Jew she was attacked because she was supposedly attacking the Jews. I think the movie is predominantly about the person in a struggle with herself. Why? Because we see a person, a philosopher, who is struggling to reconceptualize the notion of evil in political philosophy. Because Hannah Arendt, at that moment, she encounters with a new kind of evil, with a new kind of criminal, and it's precisely what Tom Keenan nicely said, that it's not all about crimes that were committed on Jews, the crimes committed against humanity. And coming back to this old-fashioned but still operable notion of the banality of the evil, and incorporated it into the context of this kind of unprecedented criminal act, I would say that there is a kind of to answer the question, we have to answer first the question about the movie. So when we started, we could say that the new type of criminal is basically a new context of rethinking the notion of crime. So the new kind of intellectual, but not, let's say, engaged intellectual, but the political philosopher is precisely born at that moment. It was half a century ago, as I said. And nowadays we don't seem to found that thesis scandalous or whatever. I would like to point to a couple of new recent books which tackle the issue of evil and crime and violence, and although they do not refer, or in some ways they do refer to the work of Hannah Arendt, they are doing it in a kind of a challenging way. The first one is the Terry Eagleton's book on evil. It's a very simple and basic title. And the other one is on violence. This is Slavoj Žižek's book, published 4 years ago. This one is two years ago. In those two books, I believe that we have some new interpretations of evil, and within, of course, Eagleton is keen to do it within the limits of English literature, and Žižek is trying to put it on the context of psychoanalysis, but it doesn't matter. It's the result is the same. The new conception of evil and criminals, and the result of it is precisely the born of the new theory of evil, a new theory of crime, of what is crime and what is violence. And this rethinking of Arendt's legacy, let's say in Žižek's interpretation, is very interesting, because then we have a division between the so-called subjective and so-called objective violence. So we don't have a violence as a general notion, but then we have it rather on a kind of symbolic level, which could be even stronger than the violence which was or is still done on the classical, let's say, the classical way. So I think that the new type of the criminal, as mentioned, provoked a new kind of rethinking of crime. So I believe, and I have the feeling while reading again Eichmann in Jerusalem, it would help us very much to understand our contemporary situation, and we have to definitely have in mind the crucial point that, as Arendh emphasized, Eichmann was not a monster, and this is on the lines of, let's say, Eagleton's interpretation of Shakespeare and whatever. He was not a monster. He was just a bureaucrat doing his duties. So, from this perspective, doing his duties, he's basically not only non-violent, but he's a good person because he was obeying the law. He was obeying the Nazi law, and he was very keen in this respect. So I would say, from this point of view, we could argue that this development of different theses on the violence and how to define it and how to defer the kind of symbolic violence, and it's also the symbolic violence which is inscribed already into the crimes committed by Nazis and Eichmann, should forces us, I think, to rethink one more time the whole concept.
Vesna, you wrote quite a lot of notes, I saw.
No, that's the way to keep myself concentrated, actually. Yeah, I would like to add to that. It's not, I don't know what kind of intellectual we need, but I know, I mean, because Hannah Arendt uses the notion of intellectual in a million different ways. Like, you know, the intellectuals you meet in America are like this and that, and the Germans intellectuals are like this and that, so I don't think she even construes the notion of, but what she tries to do, and what I think is just as necessary nowadays as it was at her time, or it's even a kind of, you know, belongs to the modernity, if not to say that it's eternal, is the category of understanding. Maybe we do have now new types of intellectuals who will think the actual situation. I'm not quite sure whether I would agree this is Zizek, but of course I don't want to go into that polemics. I don't think she would have a very good opinion about his thinking, among other things, because this way of understanding violence like a structural problem within economic productive sphere, this is something she dealt into the imperialism, which of course was the old way of the production, and now we have new technologies and new way of the production, but then it asks for the whole new range of categories. So I don't think that this kind of violence comes a bit after the totalitarian violence. The new concept of the issue of understanding is the most important, and of course it will always change. It will change according to all the new conditions we are meeting and to whatever we want to call the actual situation. Understanding is the most important, not only feature of the intellectual, because of course we know that she does not really recognize the knowledge itself as something useful for action or for understanding. Understanding is something that you reach to the process of thinking, to the permanent process of thinking and rethinking the concepts. And this is what she does. Eichmann came after totalitarianism. But we also know that after everything she covered within the totalitarianism and the constituent part of the totalitarianism, which was not translated here, everything, I think it's also imperialism, and before that anti-Semitism, but the old-fashioned anti-Semitism that belongs to the beginning of the modernity, which is this kind of a simple racism, discrimination, and so on, which did not necessarily lead to Holocaust and radical evil as she interprets it. So what she does in Eichmann and in totalitarianism all the time is trying to understand. When she deals, and I think that she actually uses the term radical evil as something as reflects the totalitarianism, you know what I want to say, as the whole. Well, with Eichmann, she introduces this new notion of the banality of the evil. And even when reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, I was also a little bit struck by the way, why did she now introduce this banality? Why was this necessary? Because as almost everything else was described before, so now she's almost an anthropological and cultural writer while reporting from Israel, and she's obviously very hard, and I think the film depicts that very well. She's obviously very hard trying to understand how did so-called ordinary people, what Eichmann might have been, how did they end in being the most monstrous war criminals, and of course being surprised. Well, I think this is a little bit made up, you know, being surprised with the notion that he might have been just an ordinary criminal, but because he became bureaucrat within the totalitarianism, so within the specific political situation and context, he stopped to think. So that is, which of course doesn't mean he stopped thinking in a kind of a basic way, but he stopped thinking in ethico-political categories. Once he accepted this political order, or was forced into it, that's an issue to debate. At that moment, he actually detached his thinking from moral tradition, from any kind of human politics. So actually, that also made him into a criminal who even doesn't understand or doesn't want to accept that he is the criminal. He was only obeying. Obeying for her means he stopped thinking. Although in one moment in the book, he tells that how the judge asked him to repeat the Kantian categorical imperative. And of course, probably every educated German can tell what's categorical imperative. But Arendh noticed that moment as a symptomatic one. Of course, Eichmann knew what is categorical imperative, but he still didn't understand, or pretended that he doesn't understand, that what he did was entirely against the tradition of the morality that existed before, or the tradition of politics, or the tradition, although in general, Arendh, of course, proved that in European intellectual culture and tradition, there always was the potentiality for evil, for personal evil, and for political evil or crime. The important question is to which she does not give the answer, I would say so, is, well, what's to do with this understanding? Once we understand how to use it politically. Because only just one more thing. She believes that acting, which is her political side of human being, which means actually being involved into the everyday, into the politics, not necessarily in organizational way, but understanding, thinking, watching, observing, and rethinking. But the action itself for her is possible without understanding. Just information and some political incentive is enough to go and fight totalitarianism. Why didn't they do it? It's another issue. But okay, you don't necessarily in this very moment need understanding. Like you can go into the struggle against tyranny, totalitarianism, dictatorship of everything, even without understanding. But the question is, what will you do after that? And this is something where we need the understanding, and probably that would be then the role of Well, no, I don't think that would be the role of the intellectual. But I'm not quite sure how would she develop this train of thought.
It might seem as though the banality of evil has become a banal phrase now. You guys might be surprised at how enduringly controversial this category is in New York intellectual circles. Arendh is still a topic of intense passion and even violence today, 50 years later. It's entirely possible to write a book in which you criticize Arendh on the basis of Eichmann in Jerusalem as an anti-Semite, as a self-hating Jew, and get it published. It's a topic which won't. It's a irritation to an intellectual sensibility which still won't go away.
There's also adoration.
True. I mean, there's a genuine, there's a debate, but it's not a kind of a fait accompli. Her interpretation, I think. It continues to surprise me when I see it in New York, but I think it's a reality.
Why is this
Because of the philosophical challenge, the theoretical challenge that her interpretation presents. She's asking for an understanding of responsibility, of mass murder criminal responsibility, to be divorced from the category of intention. That's what she's saying. She had no problem holding Eichmann responsible. She, in fact, she supported the death penalty for Eichmann against many of her fellow people who also supported the trial. So she had no question about the fact that he was criminally responsible, but she asked how we could think about criminal responsibility and responsibility, even good responsibility, properly taking of one's responsibilities, in a way that subtracted the reassurance of the category of intention from the evaluative mix. I think that's still, I mean, that's a move which is still very hard to grapple with. There's a little irony which I wanted to point out, which Eyal and I discovered when we did the research for this Mengele book. When the Mossad kidnapped Eichmann in Buenos Aires, they could have kidnapped Mengele. Mengele and Eichmann were living not together, but nearby each other in Buenos Aires at the same time. There's a 8-man Mossad team which does the surveillance, has both of them identified, but they're afraid that they can't smuggle 2 Nazis out of Argentina at the same time. They think it as a logistical problem. They can't secretly hide these 2 guys simultaneously. So they have to prioritize between Eichmann and Mengele. And they choose Eichmann, they leave Mengele behind, they get Eichmann back to Israel, and they immediately get on a flight back to Buenos Aires to get Mengele. In the meantime, Ben-Gurion has a press conference and announces that they've captured Eichmann, whereupon Mengele disappears. So they miss their chance, and Mengele later dies of natural causes. But imagine if they had taken Mengele rather than Eichmann. Imagine what the narrative of the Shoah today would be, given the centrality of the narrative that's come out of the Eichmann trial. In principle, it could be completely different, because Mengele was a monster. Mengele was exactly the
killer.
Yes,
Yeah.
personal torturer and killer, crazy person, profound ideological Nazi, author of race doctrines, exactly, early student of biology and politics. I think it's a great thought experiment. What would have come of a Mengele in Jerusalem rather than an Eichmann in Jerusalem?
Can I add something real short to that, which I think I forgot to say? At certain moments, especially watching the movie yesterday, it came to me that she maybe used the expression banality of the evil to de-essentialize the notion of radical evil. Because using this radical evil, which came out as a catchy phrase, and everybody was talking about radical evil, like equitation with totalitarianism, was kind of essentializing this one particular system of rule. And I think she became a little bit afraid of that the radical evil will become just a phrase, not really understood, how much it still is a political construction, consequences of a political deed. Although politics disappears into totalitarianism, but what did bring us into it is history and politics. So at some point it came to me that she maybe wanted to say, okay, this is actually the banality of the evil. Actually, there is the banality of the Eichmann, not of the evil. And as Margaret Sotrota actually, I think, tries to do a little bit of, yeah, she works with her dilemmas, as you said. So obviously, at the end of the movie, she herself notices that they didn't notice, she herself, Arendh herself tells, they did not notice the major controversy, that evil cannot be at the same time banal and radical. And then she says the story, goes and researches the evil okay, so maybe that was the point. Maybe she actually wanted to essentially to deconstruct the term she probably wasn't approach, but to deconstruct the notion of essential evil, which has lost its political roots, so to say.
If you agree that, at least for Hannah Arendt, one of the major points was this question of understanding. What to do with understanding when apparently once achieved? Do we have responsibility? Do we have necessity to act? And I'm asking because of this. For many people, and there's plenty of discussion after the screening yesterday about the scene scene in the woods of Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. He was certainly not an ordinary citizen, quite extraordinary in a sense, but what do we need to do? Do we need to do anything with this understanding?
Could I add just a short commentary? I think that there's a couple of things in the movie with depicts the relationship that Hannah Arendt had as a student with Martin Heidegger. They're kind of do not fit into the movie. I mean, they are in a way useless regarding to the whole concept of the movie, and they're not properly done. As we all know, there was of course a quarrel and misunderstanding, as later on was Hannah Arendt with Hans Jonas that we saw in the movie, because Heidegger was in the 30s and is in reckless speech defending the Nazism. Later on, the story was completely different. But nonetheless, there was a mistake. It's usually the interpretation that he made a mistake. But I believe that was not a mistake. It was in the line of the thinking of Martin Heidegger. So just in a way, as for example, as Foucault's often referred mistake when he supported the Iranian revolution, it wasn't a mistake. Basically, it was inscribed or embedded in his thinking. So to put it in other words, or to more contemporary with Alain Badiou and the notion of event. What I want to say is to emphasize the fact that within this horizon, Sein is not evil itself. I mean, Heidegger's approaching